Can you talk a little bit about MuleSoft's hiring process? Because the company grew a lot, and I think MuleSoft had a reputation for a really good hiring process. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah,
about it?
yeah, I'm happy to share about this. We were fortunate that I think the company grew from maybe about 400 people to, similarly 1,500, 2,000 people during my years there. But I credit Greg Shop for really giving me religion around what good hiring looks like. I had come out of Facebook. My wife was a longtime Googler, so I was very familiar with the sort of hiring philosophies and rigor that those companies had put on hiring. MuleSoft took it to another level, right? And on one hand, it's not simply the quality of candidates, but it's really designing a process that measures specifically what we need a role to do. Like, what are the outcomes we need to deliver? How do we measure those outcomes in terms of the metrics and qualitative outcomes that role needs to drive? Then breaking that back to what kind of skills and what kind of competencies that candidates need to possess to actually deliver on those outcomes well. And then devising a way to measure for those skills and competencies in an effective and repeatable way that we can then scale across the org. And so we called it, I think, Hiring 2.0, which Leslie Kirch and Leslie Crow, his team really helped partner with us to build. And basically it was that, right? How do we, instead, if I have a team that has the same role in London, in Sydney, in Singapore, in Atlanta, in SF, how do I make sure that that team is repeatedly driving really high quality candidates really repeatably, no matter what office they're in? And so for every single role, we basically said, okay, let's go define out what are the competencies needed to do that role well. What are the jobs we need to deliver well against it? Let's go actually define those. Let's call it for AEs. It's, an enterprise AE, linear execution. Can they drive a sales process orchestrate across a lot of orgs, right? Are they compelling in the room? And can they lead an effective meeting, an effective PG call, an effective follow through on an executive meeting, right? In an SDR role, it might be coachability and high growth mindset and passion for sales, because we're not just looking for recent college grads who are smart and capable, but they actually have to have a passion for going out there and mixing it up and searching for a career in sales. And as we start to define those metrics, we would basically, I should share that we actually looked at some of our strongest hires historically and some of our weakest hires historically and tried to actually do some analysis to figure out, okay, what were the skill sets, what were the competencies, what were the backgrounds and prior track records that these folks have had, so that we can actually inform this not just by using our gut, but actually looking at what the data showed us and being able to map that back to the competencies and then actually figuring out how to evaluate them. And so when we think about evaluation, right, everybody talks about, okay, let's do an interview loop. Great. That's like 101. But how do you do an interview loop really well? Well, let's actually make sure that for each of those competencies, we're breaking each interview round to go measure for one or two of those competencies, not all of them, and prescribing the questions that you can use to precisely and repeatably ask and know what a good answer looks like and a bad answer, right? So for example, for team player, right, you can say, okay, tell me about your biggest win. Great. All right. Tell me who was involved in that deal, right? Do they talk about themselves? Do they talk about the team? Do they effectively break that out in their role versus others, right? What would you have done differently in that? Did you get any feedback? Making sure that those questions are really well framed and you know what types of answers look good for whether it's team player, whether it's growth mindset, whether it's how they run a process really soundly, making sure that those are really repeatable questions with follow-ons that ideally the same interviewer or a couple of interviewers are always doing, so they become experts in vetting for that type of skill. But again, it's not just through the interviews, right? A lot of great salespeople, great go-to-market people might be great interviewers, but the reality is, how do we actually understand how they would do the role, not just talk about it? Can you design an exercise that mimics a skill or skills that they would need to do in the role? If you're hiring an EA, hey, can you walk me through this calendar and what would you do with it? What would you prioritize? What questions would you ask? Right? If you get an email from somebody saying, hey, can I get some of Rich's time? How would you respond to that? What would you be looking for? How would you prioritize, right? If you need to plan an offsite for an executive team, what would you need to know and how would you look and what are the types of things that you might start to spec out for that? It's some kind of an exercise that really helps to demonstrate, hey, in an environment that looks sort of like what they're going to be doing, how would they actually perform in that? And actually rating that with a rubric that you use every time, right? And then finally, references. And I know I've talked about this before in other venues, but so often, sometimes we do the reference call and it's like, yep, is Alex awesome? Jack Altman's going to say, Alex is awesome. But if I call Jack and I said, hey, I really want to make sure that there's the right fit. And for Alex's sake, because we like him a lot. So the more candid you are with me, the better, right? Help me understand, what are the areas of strength, but what are the areas that you are focusing on to grow? And, what are the ways that you would coach me to go work with them well to make sure that we can set them up for success? Like those types of questions that really help that reference feel like, ooh, if I answer and I blow, you know, some positivity up this interviewer's backside, it's actually not going to set the candidate who I like and trust up for success. That's really important to establish, right? And knowing that you actually care about that feedback, not just are there to check a box. That's really important. And obviously, ring fencing those references to direct managers, not pick somebody who you work with who can say great things about you, is really important as well if you don't have trusted back channels that obviously won't blow up the confidentiality of the candidacy. So just a few of the profile of a few of the elements of that hiring 2.0 was making sure that you design well, you design the process well for vetting for what you need. And then finally, you actually have controls of people who are pushing back and creating that constructive tension so that the CEO, the CRO, the fill in the blank executive needs to personally vet and inspect and actually sign off on that hire because he or she or they are confident that that person's going to be a 10Xer and raise the high water line, not the low water line of the org.
I love your answer because it just describes how much pre-work there is when it comes to interviewing and hiring people, just structuring the role and being really deliberate and thoughtful about the structure around the entire interview process. And that sort of leads you to the right outcome rather than just being really good at asking specific questions to the candidate.
Oh,
Um,
100%. And again, it sounds heavy, right? It sounds like, we got to have a ton of time and a huge HR talent team to do it. You'd be surprised at how a little bit of thought, like spending an hour or two up front to design a proper interview loop and vetting process and a proper profile so that if you have recruiters, they know what you're looking for. If you have interviewers in your panel, they know what you're looking for. That alignment around what the role needs to be and what the right candidate looks like and how to vet for it. Investing in that upfront is so valuable in driving efficiency and effectiveness and making the right hire. If you just put in like an hour or two up front.